Hello, everybody. Everyone's settled in. Hello, my name is Leisha Owen, and I'm one of the curators here at the Allport Library and Museum of Fine Arts. Very warm welcome to you all today to the Allport Library, and also to those that are listening in at home, because we're going to, Clifford's got the camera going here, and it's going to be a webinar, but a webinar where people can just listen in. They won't be interrupting the talk, as it were. And I don't think they'll be able to be seen either, Clifford. Is that right? The people on the webinar.
Oh, they'll be able to see Tim?
They can see us.
You right now?
Oh, there you go. So that's how it is. There we go. So welcome to everyone, because we had quite a few people cancelling because of illness, as we all know, in the community at the moment. So before we start, could I remind you to please silence your phones so that we won't have any interruptions. Libraries Tasmania acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of Tasmania's first people. We also pay respect to the resilience and the strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extend that respect to all First Australian peoples. The Lanney pillar, currently in the Allport Gallery, you would have walked by past it, is a collaboration between Tasmanian Aboriginal writer and curator Professor Greg Leiden and internationally recognised Tasmanian filmmaker Roger Scholes. Through images and film, Scholes and Leiden provide audiences with a retelling of William Lanney's life. Lanney's story has often been told through his connection to William Ludwig Crowther and Crowther's involvement in the desecration of Lanney's body. What is less known is that Morton Allport, who is the family of the Allport Library, was also a key figure in the scientific community and the dreadful mid-century trade of human remains. And so I'm just telling you about the Lanney pillar because the series of talks we're having, and this is the second of the talks, is connected to that, so it gives you some context. Today we have the second of the 4 lectures accompanying the Lanney pillar, and I have very great pleasure in welcoming and introducing Professor Tim McCormack. Tim is a Professor of Law at the University of Tasmania. He is also a Special Advisor on War Crimes to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague and an Honorary Professional Fellow at Melbourne Law School. Tim was appointed a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Law in 2010 and appointed by the Premier of Tasmania in 2021 to support Professor Kate Warner in mapping out a pathway to truth-telling and treaty with Tasmania's Aboriginal people. Professors Warner and McCormack began their consultations in NAIDOC Week in July last year, and this is what we're going to hear about from Tim today. The report was handed to the Premier in November 2021 and contains 24 recommendations that we look forward to hearing more about. So now can I warmly welcome Tim McCormack.
Thanks very much, Leisha. It's an honour to be participating in the series of public lectures around the Lanney pillar here at the Allport Library, and thanks to all of you for coming out. If there was no live audience, it would be less interesting, I think, than staring down the barrel of the camera. But to those of you watching virtually from wherever you are, thanks also for joining us, and thanks for your interest in the subject matter. Leisha, thank you for your acknowledgement of traditional ownership. For me, it's become increasingly important that we do that at our public events. This is an acknowledgement of a pre-existing sovereignty, a sovereignty that wasn't ceded when colonial invasion and dispossession occurred. And in our case here in Hobart, or in fact anywhere on the western shore of the Derwent between Bridgewater and Kettering, we're on Muwinina country. And when I think about acknowledging the Muwinina as the traditional owners and custodians of this land. I lament the fact that there are now no known descendants of the Moonina people. Can't say that there aren't any, but we don't know of any. And that is symptomatic of the loss that occurred here as a consequence of colonial invasion and dispossession. Moonina were obliterated, as were so many other of the Tasmanian tribes and bands that made up our Indigenous people, our Aboriginal people. And as Alicia said in her acknowledgement, we should be profoundly grateful and certainly acknowledge the resilience of the Aboriginal people that survived despite all that they were subjected to. And it's right that we celebrate their ongoing contribution to Tasmanian society and culture. And for me, it was an enormous privilege to be asked by Premier Gutwein to work with her former Excellency, Kate Warner, on this project. So I'm really keen to talk a little bit about our experience, our approach, what we heard, and what we tried to recommend in terms of next steps, and then some observations about where to from here in terms of our relations with our Aboriginal people. So many of you will know that when Kate was Governor of Tasmania, she did a lot of things, undertook a lot of initiatives really to understand and to reach out to the Aboriginal community. I mean, if you drive in the gates of Government House, next time you do that, look to the left and see the Aboriginal flag flying alongside the Tasmanian state flag when you enter the gates in the grounds of Government House. That was her former Excellency's initiative, and it was a wonderful day when the Aboriginal flag was flown to fly permanently on the grounds of Government House. So many other things that Kate did to reach out to Aboriginal people around the state, hosting events, going to events, and she took a significant public stand in relation to the importance of moving on from where we are in terms of the status quo of our relationship with the Aboriginal people. So Premier Gutwein was desirous of making some substantive steps towards a rectification of some of what's happened in the past and to changing the situation. And so he asked Kate, even before she'd left office, whether she would be willing, once she had finished up her term as governor, to lead this project. And she said she'd be delighted to do that. She knew it'd be tough, but she was really keen to do it. But she told him that she didn't want to do it on her own, and he understood that and accepted her recommendation that she work with her former student, Tim McCormack. Kate and I had done a few things together when I was Dean of the Law School here at the University of Tasmania. I tried to make a significant commitment to us as a law school being aware of and being increasingly sensitised to, making sure we teach our students about the injustices that were perpetrated on our Aboriginal people. So Kate knew that I had she and I had a shared heart, perhaps we could say, and it was a really great privilege to work with her. The Premier asked her to lead a project to achieve a couple of things. He was very keen that we meet with Aboriginal people around the state and we listen to them, and report back to him on what we heard from them, and then to also make our recommendations for mapping out what he called a pathway to reconciliation, with a particular emphasis on truth-telling and treaty, but not necessarily exclusively those things. I mean, what do the Aboriginal people want? What do they believe should happen to help us move towards reconciliation? We learnt very early on in our consultations that the framing of all of this in terms of reconciliation was problematic. This is not a uniformly held view, so I'm not trying to suggest that all Tasmanian Aboriginal people are of this view, but the overwhelming majority of people we spoke to did not like the concept of reconciliation as the end goal of the Premier's project, and our report is the first step towards that. The problem for many Aboriginal people here is that reconciliation, in their view, assumes a prior relationship to which the parties are reconciled, and in their view, that prior relationship has never existed. No stage have the Tasmanian Authority sat down with the representatives of the Aboriginal community and treated with them as an equal. And that's really at the heart of why treaty making is so important with Indigenous people around the world. We understood that. The preference that was being expressed was that this project be couched in terms of self-determination, allowing the Aboriginal people to decide for themselves what their future relationship with the rest of Tasmanian society should be, rather than imposing a particular objective. So we didn't change the title Pathway to Self-Determination, but we certainly did change the title of our report, Pathway to Truth-Telling and Treaty, and explain in the introduction what we heard from Aboriginal people about the problem with reconciliation. It's very interesting discussing with Victorian colleagues involved in the Yurok Truth and Justice Commission, and in fact the whole sort of broader Victorian government approach to the establishment of a First Peoples Assembly and the process toward truth telling and treaty making in Victoria, where our colleagues involved in the commission there said we would never frame it in terms of reconciliation, because we want to give to Aboriginal people the authority to say what it is that they actually want out of the process. So I thought that was a really great learning lesson for us. We understood what we were hearing in terms of minority voices on this, just to be faithfully representative as much as I can be. Some people said they thought that this sort of focus on reconciliation only meaning being reconciled to a previous constructive and positive relationship is a politicisation of that term. And in fact, it has a broader meaning, which can mean a healthy relationship, even if there wasn't a prior one. So we've tried to replicate that sentiment, even though it was a minority expressed view. But our task was to travel around the state to meet with Aboriginal people, to listen to them, to understand what their aspirations were, what they wanted to see happen in terms of substantive change, and how that might work out. And we obviously discussed the concept of both a truth-telling process and the making of a treaty, but also what else do you want to include in, have you got any other ideas about outcomes that you're interested in? And we tried faithfully to replicate or to summarise and to present to the Premier what it was that we heard. We had many wonderful experiences as we travelled around the state. We didn't sort of manage to do it in any systematic out to Queenstown through the Derwent Valley up to the Circular Head and the Tarpine Coast, along the northwest coast, Burnie, Devonport, Latrobe, up to Launceston. We met with a group in Deloraine. We met with a group in St Helens. We met with a group down on the Tasman Peninsula. We certainly met with the South East Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation down the Huon Valley. But it wasn't like we went on a 4-week road trip. We were sort of coming and going to different places. We also went out to Flinders Island and to Cape Barren Island, first time for either Kate or myself, and that was an enormous privilege. It's a wonderful thing to go out to meet with Aboriginal people where they were, and we had some incredible experiences on country with different Aboriginal people explaining to us why this particular piece of physical territory is so precious. But I think uniformly our experience was being welcomed, being trusted, and having the privilege of personal stories from the heart, some of them of course profoundly traumatic as you'd imagine, being shared with us. I suspect that given the fact that we had to go beyond listening and reporting what we'd heard to actually making some recommendations, we might not be as warmly welcome now, because a lot of people disagree with one or other of the recommendations that we've made. I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes. But the fact was that our experience of being welcomed and people opening their hearts to us was something that I'm sure neither Kate nor I will ever forget. We'll both look back on it as a highlight of our lives, our professional and personal lives, and something that we shared in deeply and cherish as a consequence. Kate said a number of times, I don't think I'm breaching confidences, that she wept more on the 5 months of this project than she did in the 6.5 years she was at Government House. I certainly did, but I'm sort of known for my proclivity to weeping, so no big deal for me, perhaps. But yeah, we had some incredibly precious moments as people shared not only their reflections on the history of what occurred here, but also, and I think this is a really important part of our learning experience, the ongoing consequences for their families as a consequence of transgenerational trauma from what was done to their people, and now as a consequence of that. And I think that's something that non-Aboriginal Tasmania needs to know more about and to understand. Again, I'll say a few more things about that. Let me give you just a couple of, or a few highlights about some of the things that we heard. And I'll try to then move on to sort of where to from here. There was widespread support amongst the people that we met with about the importance of a truth-telling process. There were differences of view about what that should cover, although we've tried to be comprehensive in our explanation to the Premier of what it should deal with. There's certainly a view that it's really important that for the first time in the history of Van Diemen's Land / Tasmania, that there is an official record of what actually happened historically. I mean, we know that any of us can go and perhaps many of you have, read the history of the early contact, the period of the Black Wars, Lieutenant Governor Arthur's declaration of martial law. You know, you can read all about that from a wide range and increasingly deep range of historical sources. But there's never been an official account of that from the state, and there's certainly an argument that this would be a beneficial thing, and beneficial not only for Aboriginal Tasmania but also for the rest of Tasmanian society. So one aspect of a truth-telling process for which there is widespread support is that there is a telling of an historical account, which of course would have to involve historians that are subject matter experts in this area. But there was also widespread support for the creation of a process that would give an opportunity for individuals and for family groups to be able to tell their story of what's happened to their family and what the ongoing and contemporary consequences are for them of dispossession from their land in particular, and for intergenerational poverty and for intergenerational illiteracy and a whole range of other negative consequences. And that, I mean, we had lots of discussions about how that might happen. There was a number of people said to us, if there is to be a process like that, then it really needs to be done in a culturally safe and appropriate way, not in a formal sort of courtroom type setting, but out on country with individuals, with family groups, with community groups. That there has to be professional support, because the retelling of trauma, of course, has profound consequences for those telling it, for those listening to it, for those hearing it. But that if those things are all managed sensitively and carefully and professionally, then this could be a very cathartic process. Again, not only for the Aboriginal community in Tasmania, but also for the rest of us who haven't experienced quite the same history and the ongoing consequences of it. There was also widespread support across the state for a treaty or a number of treaties. Some people wanted to argue for not a single treaty, but for treaties that might be more applicable at the local level. This is certainly a discussion that's also happening in the Victorian context as the First Peoples Assembly talks through what should be the next steps after the Truth and Justice Commission process is concluded. Should it be a single overarching treaty with sub-agreements for local Aboriginal peoples, or should there be a single treaty for the whole of the state? So there's some unresolved questions about form here, but there is widespread agreement about the importance of representatives of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania sitting down with the Tasmanian government, and in that process of some sense of equality between the parties in negotiation of the terms of the treaty, there is implicitly, if not also explicitly, an acknowledgement of pre-existing sovereignty that has never been formally acknowledged. There's also widespread agreement about the sorts of content that would be included without, it's not for me to declare what the content should be, but Kate and I heard a number of suggestions about how to arrange for handback of Crown land, and please understand that there's no one suggesting that freehold land should be revisited and your backyard can be carved up, or your second or multiple properties could be handed over to the Aboriginal people. There's no one suggesting that. But in relation to Crown land, you imagine if you're an Aboriginal person, the concept is an anathema to many Aboriginal people. And there are substantial parcels of land in Tasmania that are in that category, with subject to different licenses and arrangements in terms of exploitation and use of them. But there's certainly a widespread view amongst the Aboriginal people that more needs to be done in relation to return of land beyond what currently is scheduled in the Aboriginal Lands Act. There's a lot of discussion about participation in power and decision making. You will have heard, for example, suggestions about if the lower house is to be expanded back to its original 35 members, 7 from each of the 5 electorates rather than the current 5, then why not expand it to 37 and have 2 designated seats for representatives of the Aboriginal people to sit in the lower house, and that Aboriginal people around the state could elect which role they wanted to vote on, whether it was for those 2 representatives or whether it was in their geographic electoral territory or within the electoral boundaries. So there are certainly suggestions around that. There are also a lot of talk about some sort of restitution for land that was stolen, and in what form that would take, and quantity of amounts, of course, is to be negotiated. But it does, I understood from the process of discussing potential content of treaty to be thrashed out between the government and representatives of the Aboriginal people, that a key aspect of it must be justice for the injustices that have never been dealt with in any substantial or systematic way. And I often think to myself, I really wonder whether Tasmania is ready for that. I wonder if non-Aboriginal Tasmania is ready for that. And I think that there'll be a significant challenge for those non-Aboriginal people like Kate and I and others, I'm sure, here in the room, who are committed to a better, a more wholesome, a more just relationship with our First Peoples, that there's going to have to be a lot of advocacy work and encouragement to the government to be bold about that. We weren't asked just to listen and to report to the Premier about what we heard. We certainly tried to do that. We tried to do it as carefully as we could. So by that I mean we didn't attribute to individuals what they said to us. If we attributed anything to anybody, it was either because we quoted from a publication that they've had at some stage in the past, or with their consent. We refer sometimes in our report to what some representatives of particular Aboriginal organisations told us, and to the extent that we have attributed those, we tried to ensure that we had permission to do that. Otherwise, it would have been unfair to do it. But the Premier asked us to go beyond reporting on what we'd heard, to make recommendations to him about what the next step should be. And here I'd be disingenuous if I pretended that, well, if I took one of two positions, tried to pretend that it was all fine and everybody's really happy about it, or secondly, that I'm here to defend those recommendations. I'm not at all here to do that. I think Kate and I both share the view that this isn't about us or our report. Our report may be a catalyst to helping the government move forward into substantive discussions with the Aboriginal people. The next substantive steps beyond this preliminary, introductory laying out of the groundwork step must be Aboriginal-led. We expressed that view multiple times to Premier Gutwein, and we've also expressed that view to Premier Rockcliffe more recently. But there are unquestionably some controversial things in our recommendations, because we didn't try to please everybody. We tried to set out what we thought the government should do to move forward. And there are some big challenges, and one of the issues you'll see if you look at the report, that we describe one chapter as the vexed question of Aboriginality, where we discuss the issues around identity and eligibility for certain services or for designated positions in the public service or whatever it is. But the fact is that in every conversation we had, this issue came up. And it's clear that there are deep divisions within the Aboriginal community around this question. And I'd say that, I mean, without trying to oversimplify or trivialise what that disagreement really is, I think it is fair to say that, and by way of partial explanation, there is a conservative, restricted, limited view about only certain lines of survivability, particularly Dalrymple Briggs on the northwest coast, Fanny Cochrane Smith in down the D'Entrecasteaux, and the families on the Furneaux Islands. And in the more extreme version of this view, unless you grew up, or unless you were descended from one of those three lines of survivability, you are not part of the Aboriginal community in Tasmania. But there is an alternative, broader, more liberal, more sort of generous view, perhaps in terms of inclusivity, that though there are additional lines of survivability than those three, that there were Aboriginal people of child-bearing or child-creating age, particularly Aboriginal women of child-bearing age in Van Diemen's Land Society at the time of the exile of the roundup and exile to, well, first to Gun Carriage Island and then Vansittart and then ultimately to Flinders Island and then back to Oyster Cove. There are others that had partially or more fully assimilated into Australia, into white society here, and some of them had children to white partners, and their descendants are also entitled to claim Aboriginality. This is a really tricky question, one of profound controversy and disagreement. It's been the subject of multiple litigation. Kate and I tried to summarise the case law on this. We wrote so much about it that we had to take it out of the report and put it in an appendix because it was way too comprehensive, but it's there if you really want to study it. There's been more litigation in Tasmania around this question of identity than anywhere else in the country. That's not to suggest that the question of identity, who is and who is not an Aboriginal person, is isolated to Tasmania. It's not. It's a disputed issue in many Aboriginal communities around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities around the nation, but also a very contested issue in Indigenous peoples around the world. We just hosted a couple from Alaska, a retired judge and a poet from Anchorage, who have both done a lot of work with Alaska's Indigenous people, and we had long chats about contested issues of identity in Native Alaskan peoples, as they call themselves. So I know that this is a big issue, and it's a big issue in lots of places. It certainly is here in Tassie. And it seems as though that issue is not going to go away. It's something that the government's got to try and manage, something that they have to work carefully with Aboriginal people here with to be able to move on from it. There are questions about who will represent the Aboriginal people of Tasmania at some stage in the future when the government tries to sit down to negotiate a treaty with them. And so between now and then, some issues have to be resolved in relation to it. We made some recommendations about land and sea rights, and some of those are contested. We've had some criticism back about that. We also made some recommendations about language and Palawakani. Some of you will know all sorts of information about that, and others perhaps not so much. But yeah, we understand that the recommendations we made to government are not everyone is happy with them. In fact, everybody's unhappy with at least some of them. And yeah, I think all Kate and I can do is try to I mean, not defend it, but suggest that we've done the best that we can with a very fraught set of challenges. And now it's time for us to step back from trying to lead the process, because it must now be led by Aboriginal people. So, I mean, that of course raises a critical question, and on this I'll try to finish up, because I'd really like to take some questions from you, and I don't know whether you've got a chat function for those watching remotely, but take some questions from the virtual audience as well, if possible. But where to from here? That's of course the critical question. I think we heard from so many Aboriginal people that the worst thing that could happen out of the consultations that we undertook and the writing up of the report would be nothing, because again, as a consequence of the former governor and a sort of hanger-on that travel around the state, expectations are raised about what's going to happen. Do you really believe that? This is a question put to us multiple times. You really believe that Premier Gutwein is fair income? Yes, we genuinely believe that. We wouldn't have taken on the project if we didn't believe that. So it was very encouraging to meet with Premier Rockcliffe last week and to hear him reiterate his commitment to continuing on with this project. He and his advisors have met with multiple Aboriginal organisations over the last few weeks, and they're proposing to get, as in fact Premier Gutwein announced on the 1st of March in the opening of Parliament, a gathering of representatives of the Aboriginal people around the table. I think that's scheduled for July or sometime in the not too distant future, where the hope and expectation is that together those representatives and the government officials can talk through how do we actually move on from here, whether that's taking up recommendations that we made or coming up with an alternative set of steps to move beyond the status quo to more substantive action in relation to various issues. That remains to be seen. From my perspective, I wish them all the best, and I've tried to communicate, as I know Kate has, to the Premier as well as the Aboriginal people. If there's anything we can do to support them, then we will absolutely be committed to trying to do that. And as I said earlier on, I think that's going to be true for lots of us. If we really care about this issue, then the government is going to need to know that Tasmanians who are not part of the Aboriginal community want a better relationship with our First Peoples. That we, and here perhaps, you know, I can share a few things about personal vision. I want to be part of a state that embraces the history of the longest continuous civilization on the face of the earth. I want that to be part of who we are as Tasmanians. I want that to be something that we all cherish about our own non-Aboriginal identity, and that can only happen in a meaningful relationship with our Aboriginal community. And we're the heart-shaped island. If we can't make it happen, why should anybody else be able to do it? Thanks very much. I'm really happy to take some questions. If you'd like to ask any.
I don't think that people online can.
Okay, sure.
For that, so just are there any questions from anybody? Tim? Yes.
It's not so much a question, it's an observation. A while ago there was a university discussion with Henry Reynolds and Michael Mansell, yeah, he was there, and Kate was there too. And he was talking about truth-telling, and he very pointedly made the point that on the truth-telling commission there'd only be Aborigines.
Yeah.
Whereas you made a different point that there'd be historians in that. Now, obviously, that's another area of contention.
Yes, so the point I was making about historians is not as members of the commission. So let me try and clarify that. I was at the same lecture in the Stanley Burberry Theatre, which was, yes, that was a memorial lecture that Michael gave last year. So it's actually very, I think if I remember correctly, it was NAIDOC week. So it was the first week of Kate and my involvement in the report. The project, I should say, the very first activity that we participated in was the flag raising ceremony at Risdon Cove on Monday, and then Michael gave his lecture on Wednesday or Thursday, whatever night it was. And yes, the point he was making was that if there was to be a truth-telling process set up, it could be structured under the auspices of the Commission of Inquiry Act in Tasmania. I don't know if he went into this level of detail actually, but so I'm not quoting him here, but my understanding of what he was saying, and was that it shouldn't necessarily operate in the same formal way, for example, as the Commission of Inquiry into Sexual Abuse in Government Institutions is currently operating, which is very, very courtroom-like, with cross-examination of witnesses by counsel assisting. Didn't need to be like that, but it ought to have the powers to be able to compel evidence and to be able to acquire the material that it needs to tell the truth of what happened. And he made the point that that the commissioners, if that's the structure it's going to take, should all be Aboriginal. And he's made that point a number of times to Kate and I as we met with various groups from the Tasmanian Centre around the state, Hobart, Launceston, and also in Burnie. Michael was present for all of them, and that's certainly something he repeated. Our recommendation to the Premier in relation to composition of a commission of inquiry, or a truth-telling commission with the powers of commission of inquiry, was that it should definitely be predominantly Aboriginal commissioners, but that it might be helpful for wider political support from the non-Aboriginal community if there was a respected former judge or Kate doesn't want to include herself, I was going to say former governor, but I don't mean that because it's not about creating a job for her or for me, but a respected person who could bring broader support to the process, so that it might be seen by a broader group of especially non-Aboriginal Tasmania as an objective and rigorous process that was committed to being able to tell the truth. But that's really just something from our perspective, that's something for the government to consider. We weren't trying to say it must be 5 people, 4 of them must be Aboriginal, 1 has to come from the northeast, 1 has to come from the northwest, 1 has to come from the south. We never tried to be that prescriptive. And if in the end, as a consequence of discussion between the Aboriginal people and the government, decision is to proceed with the Truth-Telling Commission and a decision is to only have Aboriginal members, I'd absolutely support that. The idea of the historians was that if part of the function or one of the functions of a Truth-Telling Commission is to be an official record of what happened, then the Commission is going to need to bring together historians who've worked on this part of our history to help compile that history, not as commissioners, but as subject matter experts to inform that part of the work of the Commission. But thanks for the question, and I'm glad I could clarify it. So I was not suggesting old white fellas or old white women, for that matter, making up the Commission. Not that you have to be old to be an established historian, I don't mean that. You had your hand up before, in the front row, then we'll come to you.
I was going to say, seems like there's a lot of dispute about the recommendations already. Is there a risk that the process will be bogged down in dispute because of the lack of agreement? Make sure it keeps moving forward.
So perhaps if I can repeat the question so everybody down the back and also online knows what's being asked. So, and you tell me if I'm giving an accurate summary, because I don't want to misrepresent you. But the question is, given that I've described some criticisms of our recommendations, is there a possibility that the process will get bogged down in dispute, in lack of agreement, and that sort of stymie the possibility of substantive progress? That is a risk. And so now I'm answering questions. Is that accurate summary? Yeah. So I think of course, there's a risk of that, but I'm not pessimistic that that will be the inevitable outcome. One of the things that Kate and I discovered, which was extremely encouraging and for me a key source of optimism about the prospects for substantive progress, is that there are some issues, and I'd put in this category the protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage, the provision of health services, the provision of education services. There are some issues that are so significant to the Aboriginal people that those involved seem to transcend the divisions that exist. And in fairness to, perhaps I should just say, in relation to my analysis of deep division, I should also say that there are many Aboriginal people who disagree with that analysis and would say there's difference of opinion, not division. And to the extent that division exists, it is as a consequence of government policy that's been imposed on the Aboriginal community rather than coming from the community itself. So I'm talking about my view of it, but my view doesn't reflect a community view. So I think, in fairness to them, I should declare that. But one of the things that we saw were these, perhaps I can characterise them as kernels of possibility. And we've said to the government, you must nurture these, because what's happening in relation to these things is precious and should be encouraged, and there should be more of it. So, whatever you do, support those things. So that's one basis for optimism. A second one is that I believe that many people in the Aboriginal community, not all of them, but many of them, have fought for recognition, for acknowledgement that the extinction myth that Aboriginality died out in 1876 when Truganini passed away is wrong, is a fallacy, an egregious wrong, and also for rights for the Aboriginal community. They've waged that battle for nearly 5 decades, since the middle of the 1970s, and done it, with some spectacular success. I remember at law school as an undergraduate student, not only having Kate Warner as one of my professors, unquestionably my favourite, but I was at law school with Michael Mansell and Heather Sculthorpe. I grew up in the northwest in Burnie, believing the extinction myth, and they exploded it for me in their you know, in the way we related to each other and what I learnt from them. And yeah, people like them and others have done an incredible job of challenging us about the truth of what's happened here. And I think for many of those involved in the political struggle in the 1970s are still very much part of the Aboriginal community. They understand that there's an incredible opportunity that's sort of waiting to be grasped, and that and I think they want to see progress. Well, I know they do. They yearn for it, and rightly so. They fought for it for so long. So I really believe that that will help provide the incentive to ensure that some differences of opinion are overcome for the sake of the greater and collective good. Third basis for optimism, and I know you weren't asking about my basis for optimism, it was more about, you know, disagreements within amongst Aboriginal people, but a third basis for optimism that I want to throw in anyway, because I think it's really important to say, there's a number of conversations we had with non-Aboriginal people who want to see progress and are making all sorts of suggestions about how that can happen. And we see all sorts of examples of it. The willingness to gift substantial parcel of land on the East Coast by the Tennyson family is one example, but there are many others, and that's, I think, really encouraging. It seems to us that there's a greater receptiveness to making some progress on this issue than perhaps there has been previously. I'm not trying to suggest that that's a monolithically held view, that everyone in the whole estate agrees with that. I've been visiting the Tarkine coast to Kuta Rocks, just south of the Arthur River, for 42 years this year. And I know the culture down there is not as receptive to what I'm talking about. But yeah, I mean, the fact is there's a lot of goodwill and willingness to undertake substantive gestures of acceptance of shared responsibility, which I think is a wonderful thing to see. And yeah, let's make the most of that. Thank you. Down the back. We've got time, Alicia? Yes.
On the local level, who do you reconcile with? In some mainland places, you can see that there are Aboriginals who are still living in the same area where they used to live. That's fairly straightforward who they are. Other places on the mainland, people have been dispossessed but have come back. It's kind of a broken chain. I live on the Eastern Shore here. As far as I know, there is no one surviving, as you mentioned very early in the talk, to actually reconcile with.
It's true. It's true for many parts of Tasmania that there are no known descendants of the local Aboriginal people. But we also have a fascinating reality here that descendants of Aboriginal ancestors are living all over the state. And I mean, for perhaps one really good example of how to answer the question, won't answer the question for the Eastern Shore directly, but it will help answer the question, and then maybe we can talk about the Eastern Shore. But I think about the community down the Huon. Most of them, not exclusively of course, but most of them are descendants of Fanny Cochrane Smith, and they have established an operation out of Cygnet and out of Huonville and also out of Kingston. They provide services to the local Aboriginal people, maternal child health, education, some health services. And the local council, the Huon Valley Council, of course, engages with them as you'd expect that they would. That relationship between local government authorities, community organisation, and many non-Aboriginal people in the community seeing them as their local Aboriginal people is entirely appropriate and should be encouraged, in my view. Now, they would say, all of them I think would say that the Huon Valley is not the traditional land of our ancestors. Fanny Cochrane Smith came from the Bass Strait Islands in the northeast. It's not, so we're not descended from the local people. Some people would say they are, but many of them would say, oh, we're from Fanny Cochrane Smith. So this is not our traditional, this is not the traditional country of our ancestors, but we have a sacred obligation to care for this country because it's where we are, it's where our elders also have been, and the traditional descendants of people, the descendants of the traditional owners aren't here in large enough numbers to care for country, so it's our responsibility. And that we've had multiple conversations with people, not only around Tasmania, but also on the mainland about this reality that not everybody who is Aboriginal is living on the traditional or the country of their traditional elders, their ancestors. Some people say on the mainland, it's actually a majority of Aboriginal people who are not on their traditional country. So that might mean that representatives from the local Aboriginal community group won't be able to welcome people to country because it's not their country to welcome them onto, but they can acknowledge the traditional owners and also declare their commitment to care for this part of the country. And I admire that. I'm grateful for that. On the Eastern Shore, yes, there are a number of groups that sort of are around, but not an identifiable community group over there. And we don't have, I mean, the reality is we don't have an Aboriginal organisation in every local government municipality. There's 29 of them. We don't have one in every municipality. There certainly are quite a few of them. And there is a really important organisation, the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, that has a broader geographic distribution of its members right around the state than any other organisation does. And some of what I'm saying about the importance of a local group would be offensive to them, because from their perspective, they are the key representative organisation of the Aboriginal community in the whole of the state. So that's not always an easy thing to sort of sort out. And many people have asked that question of Kate and I, who do we relate to? And is it okay to relate to this group and not that group? And if we relate to this group, will we upset that group? I think it's important to be open-hearted and generous and try and accept that we might cause offence, but we'll try to, do the right thing to engage with people. Nice to see you.
Very quickly,
Hi.
thanks for everything you've told us, but I've got this tonight, that the recommendations, yours and Kate's recommendations, have they all been accepted?
So the question is, have the recommendation? I didn't repeat your question. I thought you spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, but I will repeat this one. That's not criticism, just an observation. Have our recommendations all been accepted and have any been implemented? Well, actually, one of them's been implemented, but not because we made the recommendation. The Premier announced earlier in the year, and there was a ceremony to mark the occasion of the handing to an Aboriginal organisation of 40 quotas for the commercial taking of abalone. You might have seen the press release about that. We recommended in relation to the chapter on water and sea rights that happened, but it's really important that I explain that there was a long process of work done to prepare for that before our project even commenced. And for me to even imply, let alone to say explicitly that that's one recommendation that's been implemented is a misrepresentation of what happened. Work had already been done. We said several times what we do not want to frustrate or interfere with anything that might be on the cusp of happening as a consequence. Like, don't put everything on hold because our project's happening and will take a few months. Unfortunately, that issue wasn't put on hold. Some tremendous work done by Dr. Emma Lee and some others from the Aboriginal community and the government is now working on the implementation of that plan. But that was a very big breakthrough announcement by the government. One of the things that we've said to the to successive premiers is that don't wait to deal with the bigger issues, if you like, the bigger ones in terms of the more complex ones of the establishment of a truth-telling commission and work towards the setting up of a process for negotiation of treaty, to do some other things that will communicate to the Aboriginal community around the state that you're committed to actually making some substantive progress. There are a lot of things that can happen, especially in terms of initiatives that have been raised and discussed independently of our process, and you should be pushing forward on those, because getting some of those underway or to the next stage of the process or even concluded will do a lot to communicate to various constituent parts of the Aboriginal community around the state that you are committed to making substantive progress. So get on with it. Yeah, and I mean the government certainly welcomed the receipt of our report, but they rightly, in my view, want to move forward with widespread support, and to the extent that either whole recommendations or parts of them in terms of what we thought should happen is not the preferred approach, then as long as my view about that is that it's not about us, it's about making progress. So whatever is the best way to achieve the broadest consensus about next steps, please go with it and let's see a difference happening. Thank you.
We
Great
did get
question.
something online.
Oh, terrific.
Somebody said, Tim, you talked about all of us learning about Aboriginal Tasmania and hopefully move towards a future state where we all know much more about Palawa history and today's dynamic community and culture, and where this becomes part of all Tasmanians and how we see ourselves, as more a comment.
Yeah.
So.
I did say that, and I believe it. One of the best pieces of advice that Kate gave to me while she was governor, on my very first day in the job as Dean of the Law School, there was a welcome morning tea, and I spoke a few things, and I talked about how in preparing to take over the role of moving the family down from Melbourne back home to Tassie, I thought a lot about this issue, about injustices of the past and the need to deal with them more substantially and fulsomely than we've ever done before. And that as the law school wanted us to be committed to that, amongst other things. And I got a little bit emotional about it. And Kate said to me, please, can we have a chat about it? I've been thinking a lot about these issues myself, never heard a Dean of the Law School say these things. Can we please have a chat? So I went up to Government House the following week and we had a really good chat. And one of the things she said was, do some education of yourself, because it's a very complex set of issues. So please make sure you read up on some things, and here's some really good sources you can read, and here are some people that you can talk to that will give you really wise counsel. And that was terrific advice to me. I'm in the process of trying to educate myself, and I can say now I understand a lot more than I did 4 years ago, but I'm not trying to pretend that I'm a subject matter expert, and I'm also very mindful of the fact that my family were never subjected to what Aboriginal people have been subjected to. So yeah, it's important to come with an open mind and an open heart, but not to try and believe that somehow or other we know it all and have experienced it all, or be dismissive of it and say, you know, it happened 200 years ago, it's time we just, forgot about it, moved on. That is a totally unacceptable position from my perspective. It's way more complicated and traumatic than that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. It's an appropriate place to make that statement about history here in the All Port. We're surrounded by it in the archives and the library, and it's just lovely. Thank you very much, Tim, and to Kate Because we all really appreciate how difficult it must have been and how it will be difficult. And as you said, Tim, not only for the Aboriginal people, but for everybody who lives in the state, who wants to see justice done and who appreciate the correct historical record will come to light and be official as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.